Our next speaker is a groundbreaking figure in the world of data and digital tech policy. Taiwan's Digital Minister Audrey Tang has blazed a trail with her innovative and radically inclusive work, transforming government and society for the data age. Who better to speak to about what the future holds as the ODI launches its new report, Experimentalism and the Fourth Industrial Revolution. We're delighted that Minister Tang is joining us in conversation with the ODI's Head of Public Policy, Zimeta.
So, Audrey, history has shown us that new technologies can create new social and economic challenges, but they can also themselves be tools for addressing these new challenges. And I think you've done some really interesting things along these lines with Taiwan. And I wondered if you could say a bit about that.
Sure. So Taiwan is the first attempt in the national government in Taiwan back in 2014-15 to crowdsource the agenda for lawmaking and rulemaking on emerging technology issues. We deliberated on, for example, the Uber ride-sharing case. We deliberated on the Airbnb case, on whether to introduce new regulations for non-consensual intimate images and things like that. So the challenges posed by the digital world is deliberated with the stakeholders the same way that internet governance works, which is with people who have some ideas of how to tackle it together. The initiative was not started by me. It was started by the former minister, Jacqueline Tsai. She proposed it in a civil society community called G0V or Gov0 in a hackathon, actually, in 2014. She asked around, saying she has an idea that maybe we can talk about those internet issues with the help of the internet. So it's about harnessing the collective intelligence of civil society, and we use cutting-edge tools, AI tools, but not for automating away deliberation, but for assisting deliberation. So we call it assistive intelligence. And Polis, for example, lets people see their commonalities, the good enough consensus across deeply divisive tribes, deeply divisive ideology factions. They can nevertheless see whether you think of Uber as an exploitative gig economy or a sharing economy for the common good. Everybody agrees on the insurance, on the registration of vehicles, on the fare, surge pricing, but also taking care of the local rural temples and churches and so on. Turns out most of us agree on most of the things most of the time. But the more antisocial form of social media focus on the divisive parts, not the co-creative parts.
I think that's really valuable and important because by using the very same digital technology for the consultation that you're consulting on, it's a way of practically showing people this can be beneficial, right? But it recreates the context of the thing that they're deciding and they're discussing about. So it's really important to have that, rather than almost separating the technology and the community.
Indeed, and while Taiwan was a hackathon project maintained by the civil society, since 2015-16, we have institutionalized this process into us basically merging the fork that we did in the civil society back to the government as I become the digital minister in 2016. The Join platform, which is maintained by the ministries jointly, collects as long as there's 5,000 signatures collected online. It's not a referendum, it's not decision making, but it compels a minister level response. And if the topic is cross-ministerial, then it's an interagency meeting where we meet with the stakeholders who petition for example, banning plastic straws in takeout bubble tea drinks, or which actually happened, or changing the time zone of Taiwan to +9, which didn't quite happen, and so on, meeting the people where they are. This is important because then the institutionalization convinces the career public service, the civil servants, that actually early discussion is good for them because it reduces the risk. It reduces the risk of people suddenly discovering a decision making that affects them, and they have no way to propose a better idea, and so they must protest, go to the streets and things like that. If you include people early on in the game, actually it lowers the risk for the career public service. This is also something new.
That's really interesting because in our project, Experimentalism and the Fourth Industrial Revolution, we were thinking about the kinds of skills that and capacities or frameworks that policymakers will need in order to adapt to policymaking for the digital age. And so it sounds like what you're describing here is that kind of public participation early, which, as you say, a lot of career civil servants would find as intimidating, actually, potentially, because it's hard to predict how that might go.
Yeah, I often say that if you publish data unrelated to privacy, so non-personal data, NPDs, if you collect the data, hoard it, and then publish only when the civil society asks you through freedom of information, there's a distrust between the citizen and government. However, if we publish upon collection, those non-personal data. For example, in early 2020, we published every 30 seconds the real-time inventory of surgical masks in all pharmacies in Taiwan. And because it's a real-time open API feed, people who accuse us for, underproducing the masks, not distributing it fairly or things like that, can just look at the numbers and actually propose good solutions to solve those distribution issues. So it turned the opposition party into a co-creating party, and more than 100 different civil society tools were built around those open APIs that help people with seeing difficulties through a voice assistant or chatbot or so on to locate the PPEs and later on rapid testing kits and so on.
I think that's really interesting, but also really brave, because if data is being published at that speed and at that volume, there's a risk of also publishing failures. Yeah. And I wondered how you...
Yes, but every 30 seconds, it means no civil servants actually look at the data. It's entirely machine published. And the thing about career public service is that if you have approved that, then you are to blame. You're accountable for the data quality issues, for the data bias, and so on. But if we publish every 30 seconds, turning it into a real-time open API, it's clear that no public servant ever look at that, right? So paradoxically, it relieves them of blame.
I think that's really interesting, because what you're describing there with that co-creation, it's the kind of co-opting of a kind of political opposition as collaborators and partners. So there's this kind of reimagining of the political landscape in an experimental and adaptive way.
Yes, that's exactly right. And I want to ask you a question, because the same people, the Gov0, G0V community, many of them are now advocating something that is a natural progression from real-time open data. And this is called public code. As you know, the Free Software Foundation Europe has initiated this idea called public money, public code, saying that not just the data must be open, but also the organizational and regulatory code and the source code to produce those open data, those information systems. They need also to be published as free software or open source, right? So this is a quite new movement starting, I think, 2017. Have you heard of this idea? And if you do, what's your take on it? Is it complementary to open data? Is it something else entirely?
I think that I am familiar with the kind of open code movement. I think it is complementary to open data, although slightly separate. I think that one thing that we're encountering with open data, and that touches on open code, is that being mindful of the ways openness, although it can enable more equitable innovation and equitable participation in innovation, there are ways in which it might actually reinforce existing biases or power structures. For example, which communities are best placed to make the most of open data or to participate in open code? It might be those communities that are already very well resourced. And we know through our current project on experimentalism, talking to, for example, Indigenous communities in Africa and in Australasia, sometimes actually they've been a bit suspicious of open data and open code because it seems to be a way to kind of extract kind of parts of their heritage in ways that don't allow them to participate equitably. So just mindful of the criticisms of it too.
I see. So it must be done contextually, is what you're saying, within the cultural framework and adhering and supporting the cultural norms, not disrupting the cultural norms to fit this maximizing openness ideology.
I think so, yeah. It's thinking who benefits from openness and are the benefits equitably distributed? So, it might be that lots of communities will benefit from openness, but will they benefit equitably? And just kind of thinking carefully around that.
Thank you. That's a very important point. Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes it was challenging for us to hear that, but also really important to get critical feedback, I think. And just think about one's aims and one's purpose.
Right. Whether we actually reinforce the existing privileges or whether we're doing this in a truly inclusive way. I believe the mask map example works so well because there are people supporting Taiwan's 20 national languages, many of which indigenous, and the Taiwanese Sign Language too, and so on. So people focusing on accessibility, on indigenous languages, on transcultural connections, and so on. If they intentionally ask for the supporting open data and public code, and we provide to their benefit because they demand it. This kind of co-creation led by the civil society, the social sector, tend to be more equitable. But any top-down way of just maximizing the data set downloads and things like that tend to kind of miss this inclusivity as the main point.
Yeah, and on that kind of top-down versus bottom-up, one thing that we tried to do was recognizing there's already kind of power asymmetries. Instead of just framing it as inclusion, we invited minority groups and groups that might otherwise be marginalized. We actually reframed them as leaders and as pioneers. But what's your experience has been of working kind of, sort of empowering bottom up rather than top down?
Yeah, indeed. My philosophy is really to empower people closest to the pain. No matter whether they are the frontline health workers doing, vaccination pharmacies and masks and rapid testing during the pandemic times, or whether they are the people who support the groups most affected by disinformation and information manipulation and conspiracy theories. I'm talking about the social workers, the people who support their elders, and so on, who just see this onslaught of foreign interference that try to decimate democracy, try to convince them not to go to vote because the ink on the ballot is printed by CIA and will be invalidated. It doesn't matter who you vote, and so on. So there are all these, rumors, conspiracy theories, and so on going on. And I think these conspiracy theories, disinformation, are kind of like a symptom. Just like when people have good practices of hand sanitation and so on, tend to get respiratory diseases in a slower fashion. If you see pockets of acuteness, that's mostly because they were previously excluded from the public health and social work system. Exactly the same idea applies here. If there are pockets of people who feel excluded from the democratic process, like their decisions, their voice doesn't matter at all, then that tend to be the pockets that you see conspiracy theory and disinformation and so on grow the quickest. So instead of doing anything like censorship or lockdown or top-down shutdowns, what we do is to introduce people to the art of fact-checking in a humorous way. We call it humor over rumor. So it's using, for example, very cute spokes dog, Shiba Inu, putting their food to their mouth, saying, mask protects your own face against your own dirty hand, and so on. Very cute, easy to understand memes that build solidarity between generations, between cultures, and so on. And because they are all Creative Commons licensed, they can be also remixed by the local people in their own language, in their own customs, in their own culture, and so on. So I think here we emphasize bottom-up, so-called bottom-up innovation, precisely because marginalized, oppressed, and minoritized communities can take hold of their own cultural production and therefore still engage in a democratic conversation as a equal voice. So I think I fully support your point there.
I think what you say there about kind of solidarity is really key, because ultimately what you have to be doing is building solidarity between diverse communities. And we found that, I think certainly when working with, as you say, minoritized, oppressed or marginalized communities, they're not a monolith, right? So they don't necessarily all want the same things. But how do you build solidarity between them, but also solidarity between the mainstream communities who have maybe been historically oblivious, and might need to relearn their ways of kind of negotiating. So doing that with art and with sort of literature and so on creates a playful space for us.
Very much so. And another form of solidarity is, for example, our indigenous community connecting with, well, the Maori from New Zealand, supposedly there's the same roots, but also indigenous communities in Canada, in many different jurisdictions, like in a indigenous nation to indigenous nation gesture. I'm reminded of in early 2020, by popular demand, when we were rationing out the surgical masks. Some people already have masks in their home because of the SARS experience. There's people who stockpile masks, so they don't need the government rationed masks at all. And by popular demand, we developed a feature in our universal healthcare app where you can just with a push of button say, all my uncollected mask quota, I want to dedicate it to international humanitarian aid, just like that. And half of people choose to write their name on it like an NFT. They receive a badge for it, and half people decide to donate anonymously. And very quickly, more than 7 million mask pieces were collected this way and distributed to international aid. Of course, that also was a kind of altruistic cycle, because the next year, 2021, many of the community who received those masks donated their vaccines to us. So I think this is really good, because this is true people-to-people tie and partnership. This is altruism through data connections, and that brings the common best values from these indigenous and transcultural different communities together, because everyone understands that there are people suffering even more than Taiwan across the world. Well, any place that's not New Zealand actually suffers more than Taiwan. So we need to give out anything that we can. So this donation, this international connection, I think is also another, in addition to listening to the marginalized needs and so on, that this altruistic drive is also part of thing that provides real solidarity.
It's thinking about digital technologies as enablers rather than as tools of oppression. But I want to, if I may, come back to an earlier comment you made about, is it GovZero, the civil society initiative? So we've been talking about solidarity between different groups. How do you build solidarity between, what you were describing there was solidarity between maybe civil society as a disruptor, and kind of, a kind of, top-down infrastructure, right?
Right. And this is fascinating because unlike the geopolitical distance, which limits your neighbors to, the points on Earth, right? This kind of non-geo, but maybe ideal political distance, proximity, connects people who share similar values. So, for example, if I adopt Creative Commons license and you do too, it doesn't matter which jurisdiction we are in, our data become compatible instantly. If you are into, for example, the interplanetary file system, part of the Web3 storage layer, which lets everyone donate their hard drives to help store abundant copies of each other's data. For example, our ministry, the Ministry of Digital Affairs, MODA, have our homepage also published on the IPFS in addition to the Wild Web. And so anyone around the world can see when the external actors mount cyber attacks to deny us service, to shut down the websites of Taiwanese official homepages. Anyone can donate a little bit of their hard drive and connectivity to help us afloat, even during a cyber attack. But by doing so, they're also contributing to, for example, preserving the Wikipedia, preserving the Internet Archive, preserving the independent journalistic work in authoritarian regimes so they don't get tampered with and so on. So this is a ledger that unites people who want to pursue censor-proof, tamper-proof file storage. And this value brings together people who otherwise will never even understand that we share the same values. So this is I think the proposition that openness lets people who share similar values discover each other.
I really love that point. Nietzsche talks about, the future sort of techno-scientific utopia will place all its hope on science and technology. But obviously the real problem and the real solution is humanity itself. And he says that there will come a time when we mistake information for wisdom. And I think that the kind of abundance of data that we have now really challenges us as policymakers to navigate that with wisdom. Sometimes the solution isn't more data, but sometimes it's about like working with wisdom with the data we've already got. And I think it's cutting through the hype, to actually thinking, well, what does it mean to act wisely here? And, what do policymakers need to do to feel confident that they're acting wisely in the digital age?
Indeed. One of the, I think, breakthrough also first happened in the blockchain space is the advent of zero-knowledge proofs and related crypto technology like homomorphic encryption and so on. What they do is that they decouple the raw data visibility and the computation and use. So it's possible then to show a proof that you are of the legal age or things like that without actually revealing your age. It's now possible to reveal, for example, contributing to the AI models to diagnose COVID from X-ray scans, but provably say that actually this algorithm has no visibility to any raw data of the X-ray themselves and so on. So by decoupling computation from the raw data access, it lets the use of data to not dominate our conversation about personal versus non-personal, private versus public versus open and so on, and concentrate on what's the shared value, what's the value around which we can build trustworthiness. And with this stewardship, with this trustiness, then go back and look at the privacy enhancing technologies and piece them together so that we form the right data collaborative or data coalition.
So focusing on the problem that needs to be solved rather than focusing on the data or the technology itself. So focusing on impact.
Yep.
But I think part of what we're seeing with, what's so-called the fourth industrial revolution is it's exactly the impact itself that's so unprecedented and so fast that makes it hard to navigate with confidence.
That indeed is true. And just like a virus that mutates, right, very quickly, the only way really to contain that is to distribute the knowledge also evenly and quickly, so that everybody who are closest to the pain can identify what's actually going on and figure out the solution there. And this is what Kevin Kelly calls a scenius. So unlike the genius, which is in the genes, a scenius is in the scene, right? In the organizational configuration of a pro-social space, which lets the good ideas thrive and amplify itself with a very quick iteration. We have seen it here in Taiwan with our Reddit equivalent, the PTT, running for 25 years now by the academic sector, by the Taiwan National University, by undergrads really, as open source, accepting patches, giving out moderator privilege only to the people who contribute and so on. And so it co-evolved with internet without advertiser or shareholder value as a kind of capitalist drive. And that allowed the PTT to discover the COVID before anyone, which allowed us to start health inspection the first day in 2020 and so on. So this kind of collective intelligence really works.
That's really interesting because what you're describing there in terms of the kind of distributed knowledge and distributed decision making, it's almost a rewriting of the social contract, which is something that we have seen in previous industrial revolutions. Each industrial revolution rewrites the social contract between, kind of community and government, but also between government and industry and people, right? It's a three-way social contract, and each industrial revolution rewrites it. And I think certainly for this fourth industrial revolution, pandemic response almost created a new role for industry. Like, the digital technology companies were really pivotal in kind of supporting pandemic response and almost acting like civic bodies or civic infrastructure. Yep. But I think not as much attention has been paid to the ways in which communities might have a different role in, a different role in decision making, or kind of like what you're describing as collective intelligence in society after the fourth industrial revolution.
Yep, exactly. I'm actually writing a book about that at plurality.net. And the book itself will be co-created. So in due time, send me pull requests and so on. We're just collecting the forms and patterns that works as collaboration across diversity, enabled through technology. And we want to make sure that everybody understand that these patterns, whether it's turning a top-down hierarchical structure in a workplace or turning a top-down hierarchical structure in the government, it actually functions the same. It's not about taking down or tearing down existing traditions. It's just to build bridges so that multiple traditions can co-create to find good solutions that everybody can live with.
I'm really looking forward to that book. What we've been doing in our project, we weren't calling it collective intelligence, we were calling it crowdsourcing and co-creation, but recognizing the limits of our own knowledge as a project team, we were publishing our summaries and publishing our work as the project evolved. So instead of just only publishing something at the end, we wanted to share our experience of learning and working this field out, and in that way try to give others the confidence of kind of like, working in the open and capacity building for others by learning in public. But also we published all our summaries as documents that people could comment on, because we wanted to kind of be getting feedback in real time, but also be encouraging others to share their knowledge. So we would include a resource guide and then invite people to tell us what's missing from the list, so that it became a community of practice.
It's a toolkit approach where people can pick and choose the parts that work for them and then contribute back. That's excellent.
And where we don't position ourselves as the ultimate knowledge holders and the ultimate experts, but that we ask for input and so on. We did find it challenging, because it's
not natural. The first time I saw Wikipedia actually working, I'm like, what, you publish and then you edit? Yeah.
It's hard because it's hard to make mistakes in public. But then it's, I guess, building that resilience both in yourself, but also in others, that they can kind of feel comfortable with you making mistakes in public if that's what happens.
Exactly. I think I have this favorite quote from Leonard Cohen, who says, and I quote, there's a crack in everything, and that's how the light gets in. End of quote. Sometimes it's those mistakes that draw the people in, and if you don't shy away from sharing things that are just 5% ready, then it actually creates a larger canvas. Because if you perfect something to such a degree that everybody can just press like or something, it actually doesn't create a community.
I love that quote. Yeah, and we'll bear it in mind for our work that by kind of by working in the open and learning in public, we're actually letting more light in.
Great.
So I think in the past you've described yourself as a conservative anarchist. How do you find the balance between reconciling tradition and innovation?
So by conservative, I mean we honor existing institutions. It's a fundamental respect for the traditions. In Taiwan, for example, 20 national languages, indigenous sign language, and so on. So conserve means not use the digital technology to progress to the benefit of one culture out of 20 and then just decimating or even erasing the other 19 languages, as we have seen many other digital transformation projects to do in multicultural society. So this small c conservative. And also it's like the Postel's law in the internet. I'm conservative in what I do, but liberal in accepting what other people do. So that's my first point. And the second thing is that to me, anarchism, or I think it's also called libertarianism in the US, means fundamentally not giving top-down coercive orders or accepting such orders. This is about voluntary association. So the MODA, the Ministry of Digital Affairs, which I head now, has zero power to put people in prison. For example, if we can make humorous videos telling people that Bitcoin, consume a lot of energy, and maybe you can consider a proof of stake coin instead. But if people go and use Bitcoin anyway, we can't do anything to stop them. So by focusing on the influencing or amplifying or building good norms and so on, this is a very Taoist approach. And indeed, the Taoist norm, very strong in Taiwan, is also called the Tao of the Internet, right? So the Internet itself was built from this multi-stakeholder voluntary association. If any of the telcos in early internet doesn't connect to the internetworking, well, they don't become part of the internet. The internet doesn't have a navy or army to force the telcos to join the internet. So the multi-stakeholder governance has been the core of internet governance. So long story short, I think this idea of conservative anarchism refers to the root of the internet, which is a network of networks. And my work is in a non-coercive way, non-violent way, show that collaboration across diversity brings better result compared to the top-down way of doing things.
This has been really interesting for reflecting on, what you've been doing so far and how data and digital policy are evolving in the present. What do you see as the biggest challenges and opportunities coming up for the next 10 years?
Yeah. I think digital resilience is one of the critical traits, and especially after Russia's aggression to Ukraine, the war, people are now focusing a lot on how to quickly not just recover from adversity, but also adapt and transform from the experience to strengthen our own fitness. So, for example, in Taiwan, we're looking at ways to connect to satellites, to the low Earth orbit and mid Earth orbit, and mount these receivers on a mobile platform, maybe a car, maybe a boat, maybe a drone. And when our submarine cables or other data centers are under threat, we can just very quickly deploy those 700 mobile bases so that people can still connect to 5G network in times of earthquake, typhoon, and maybe war, right? And all this is, I think, based on a renewed interest in looking at the internet as a kind of fundamental human right, where people, even in disasters, even in natural and unnatural disaster situations, if they do have a connection to the internet, they can improve their own conditions and also let the other know what's actually going on. Because as I mentioned, disinformation or conspiracy theory is really just a symptom of a appetite for information, but a lack of journalistic output from the first-hand report. When Russia attacked Kiev, I stayed up all night, right, scrolling for the images and videos from Kiev Independent, from all the different journalists reporting there. But imagine if they don't have broadband internet, if Zelensky wasn't able to broadcast his, I need ammo, not a ride message, or things like that. The same appetite is there. So it will be satisfied by propaganda, by disinformation, by conspiracy theories, and so on. So to not let disinformation saturate the information space, we need to work both with journalism and civic journalists, and also provide high bandwidth, low latency communication at all times. And these two together, I believe, is a very interesting challenge that we must tackle in the next few years for democratic resilience.
I think that's a really interesting point about the appetite for information will always be there, and so it's about making sure that appetite is fed in a healthy way. When you're talking about resilience, I think one thing that lots of kind of regions are thinking about climate change, and I think that pandemic response showed us how international cooperation can work around data and digital tech, but also where the gaps are. And I think it's going to be really important that we kind of address those gaps and improve that international cooperation for trust that that the international community is going to be able to use data and digital tech to mitigate climate change, which is also going to need a lot of experimentation because it's unprecedented.
Very much so. And also, because I'm wearing the T-shirt of Presidential Hackathon, which for 5 years running is the largest presidential office level event to gather people's demand for open data, and us releasing the open data and guaranteeing personnel and budget and regulatory support to top 5 teams every year. And it includes a kind of ideation phase in the presidential hackathon where people do not code can nevertheless describe a ideal future to kind of intuition pump the hackers, the civic hackers that can then turn those wishes into working presidential hackathon ideas. That collaboration works really well for the past few years, but we tend to see that on really important systemic issues like climate change and so on, the ideas goes far into the future, so that no current technology can tackle these issues. So we've separated out, forked out from Presidential Hackathon, a separate event called Ideathon, where we ask people to write a journalistic report from the year 2040. And to imagine the world as it is in 2040 in science fiction form, in short science fiction form. And our reward, of course, is not to guarantee budget until 2040, cannot promise that, but to help them to work with science fiction directors to turn these ideas into immersive experiences that you can go into a room or wear VR and live in that future for a while to pump the intuition of our scientists and researchers because they've lived in that future already. So it's a way to free the future. It's called Ideathon.
I love the way that you've described that, because it means people don't need to be coders to contribute and to participate, you know, so it's properly multidisciplinary rather than creating a kind of techno-scientific elite, you know, of those who've done computer science and those who haven't. And one of our speakers in our project, I think Divine Fu from Humanities, the Institute for Humanities in Africa, he talked about how, you know, our notions of AI kind of, he called it keyhole masculinity. It's a kind of masculinity that observes people through keyholes. You know, it's almost like a surveillance kind of culture, right? So it's really important to think about an emotionally more holistic and kind of, you know, like a different kind of psychological starting point for thinking about data and digital tech. And there it's thinking about the kind of the leapfrogging idea in international development, that instead of the kind of emerging economies following the same trajectory as the global north in economic development, that they could just leapfrog the kind of industrial stage or the last industrial revolution and go straight to the fourth industrial revolution and maybe have hybrid economies, maybe hybrid agrarian digital, for example. So thinking about the ways they can kind of like sidestep the mistakes that the kind of West have made and not necessarily work within the colonial frameworks that they've been constrained by so far.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, excellent. I think you mentioned that math is a kind of neutral space, right, for people to work in, to discover each other. I think the future is also such a neutral space. When thinking about the welfare of future generations, people do tend to be more pro-social, just like when looking at Earth from the space. Right, the overview effect makes us better humans, mostly because we're not then caught in the keyhole kind of approximations and calculations of today or next quarter, but rather can think in a more holistic fashion. So I think whether it's the future, it's the entire planet, it's math and things like that, it's great that we can connect to this holistic vision, because I believe that increased dimensionality is exactly how we're going to really solve the wicked problems of this generation, but not closing off possibilities of future generations to be humble toward 7 generations down the line to be a good enough ancestor, if you will.
I really like that. And by, you know, leaving some things, as you say, not closing off possibilities, that we can carry on letting the light in.
Yep, exactly, to free the future. Yeah.
Thank you, Minister Tang, for a fantastic conversation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. It was a really great fireside chat, and I wish you live long and prosper.
Thank you, and you.